Okay. Good evening. I welcome you all and begin with a question, a rhetorical question, which philosophers and thinkers and psychologists of all sorts have always, over the years, over the ages, have wondered whether the world in which we live and society in which we live, is it a fundamentally a good world or a bad world? I don't mean to put it in such simplistic terms, but a debate has been raging, as I said, over the millennia about whether people are fundamentally kind and good people or selfish and cruel. And there are arguments to be made according to each approach, with different proofs. You know, we've seen people behave the most atrocious and an unkind way to others, but we've also seen humans rising to high and great standards of nobility and self-sacrifice for their fellow, even for strangers. So, beyond the simplistic question, of course, you could always say that we have two sides, we have two voices inside of us, which is not new. We hear about the idea of a yetzer tov and a yetzer hara, which means a good inclination, an evil inclination, or the way the mystics put it, a divine soul and a animal soul, a nefesh halakit, nefesh habamid. So we have these two voices or two inclinations inside of us, and one leans toward beauty and love and giving, and the other one is selfish, narcissistic, and driven by self-interest. And these two voices conflict with each other. They're at battle, at war. Entire book of Tanya, especially section 1 of Tanya, it's a classic mystical work of Shnei Zalman of Liadi. His theme is this battle, the battle between these two souls within each of us. And sometimes this one wins, and sometimes that one wins. You know, like the kid who used to come always late to school, and finally the teacher said to him, "Listen, you come one more time, you'll be expelled. One more time you come late, you'll be thrown out of school." Okay, so for a few days, he straightens out and he comes on time. But then after a week passes, he's back to his old schedule, coming like 2-3 hours late. So his teacher calls him over and said, "Didn't we discuss this?" He says, "Listen, I'll tell you the truth. I woke up on time, and I had a voice in me that said, go to school. But then another voice came and said, why don't you sleep for a little while longer? And the other voice said, no, you better go." And I said, by the time they finished arguing, 2 hours had passed. So here I am. Finally, the voice that said go prevailed. So, this is the story of life. So we all have our struggles. When it comes to looking at the universe in general, if you take a more, I always put it as a Freudian, Darwinian perspective on human beings and on life, it's a pretty pessimistic picture, actually. Because if the driving rule, cardinal rule of existence is survival of the fittest, and the driving force inside the psyche of a human being is the id, which is self, me, everything about me, and all the so-called civil rules that we write are superimposed to coexist, then essentially, when you cut to the heart of it, we human beings are really animals, interested in only one thing, ourselves. However, whether it's because of self-interest and self-preservation or other reasons, we develop a type of certain civility that allows for coexistence, red lights and green lights. But if you were left to your own recourse and there were no cops and no accountability, everyone would be taking red lights all the time. So it's like a superimposed rules that make sense, and either we follow them or we break them, or we figure out, maneuver how to find loopholes, etc., etc. So in that context, the universe, you can say, is a very cruel place. And left to their own resources, humans would kill each other, except, as I said, either self-preservation or fear of being caught, or fear of being embarrassed. Whatever the reason is, we behave to some extent. But you look around in corporate America today, not just today, and you don't have to be brilliant to understand that those that got caught are only a small percentage. You know, it's like when I see that cartoon. What was it? Another cartoon. They asked. It wasn't actually a true story. They asked one of the Texan guards that protects the Mexican-American-U.S. border. There was a strong drop in arrests of people smuggling over the border. So they asked him, "What do you think the reason for that is?" He says, "I guess we caught all the dumb ones." You know. So now the smart ones are not being caught, basically. So it's not there's less lower rate; it's just they're not catching them. So, in other words, what we know is a little tip of the iceberg, and when the regulatory systems break down, as they have now in our economy, it gets exposed. Except nobody wants to even think about the unthinkable, that everybody is corrupt. Basically, you know, you want to believe there's some honest people, but the truth is, if someone can cheat, why shouldn't they? There is such a philosophy out there. I know each in our own heart people have a conscience, but a conscience is also quite a mercurial force. One day you feel bad, the next day you don't feel so bad. You know, we can learn to, let's call it this way, numb our consciences. I'm sure we all have had a little experience in that. And you try it once, you taste from the forbidden fruit once, twice, 3 times, after a few times, it gets easier to do. What do you think, Jeff? Is that true? Okay. So, but then there's the other perspective, using the terms from the book of Song of Songs, Shir Shirim, where it says, "Basar ligani achesikala." It's referring to God, who says, "Come to my garden, my sister, my bride." And the Medrash and the commentaries explain that the universe is a garden, is in truth a garden. It may get obscured by many weeds, and despite the number of weeds and the number of called obstructions, the universe fundamentally, and also the human being, essentially remains a garden that may be concealed, that may be hidden, that may have wandered away from its true destiny, and that each of us really is an angel, and even if we may behave like a devil at times. So there's an angel hidden in there somewhere, as I've been quoting from Michelangelo. And you carve, how did he discover these beautiful angels? He says he saw the angel trapped in the marble, and I carved and set her free. So within the marble of our lives, or not sometimes concrete or other substances, there's an angel trapped in this material world, and despite the external hostility and cruelty of existence of life, within it all there is a garden there somewhere. They used to say about Ronald Reagan, the ultimate optimist, like that good country boy. He walks into a barn and he sees a barn filled with manure from the floor to the ceiling. So most of us would exclaim something I don't want to express here, but a little naive, innocent country boy says, "There must be a pony in here somewhere." You know. So even in a negative situation, you can see sometimes some type of spark, some silver lining, as they say. And it's a way of looking at life that even though it could be very dark, but there must be some light in there somewhere, somewhere buried, some gem, some beauty. And this is the Torah approach to life. That's the difference between the two approaches. The one I elaborated on earlier, perhaps, maybe is the current and contemporary secular view of life, from a Torah perspective, the universe was, is, and always remains a garden, and human beings are ultimately angels and beautiful souls. Yet they can be trapped and get stuck in places that are far, far away, and wander far away from our own ultimate destinies. And this is not just a matter of philosophical semantics. It has real implications. On a very basic level, when we talk to each other, so if I saw you or you saw me as fundamentally selfish beasts, so there's really no hope. We can come up with some contractual negotiated agreement, but you really can't trust each other. So there's really no fundamental love or trust. But if you see another person as essentially as a soul, as a divine entity and a gem, even though they may have selfish elements and other inclinations, because we all have our challenges, but it's a different type of connection. You know there's hope. And especially if you deal with healing and helping people grow, that belief that a person has within them, a beautiful, beautiful soul, is not just some type of tangential element. It's critical to the whole process, because you believe in that soul. So imagine someone who's working with you, whether it's a coach, whether it's a friend, whether it's a person who loves you, whether it's a parent or educator, a mentor, whatever it is. And they really fundamentally believe in you, and you feel it resonates, that belief. It's a whole different story when someone's just mouthing slogans and say, you have great potential. So this is not just a difference of, as I said, language or semantics. It comes down to really how we see each other, what potential. Someone believes in you can elicit from you all kinds of different strengths and powers that someone who doesn't really believe in you will never elicit. And we are impacted. We are not an island unto ourselves. We're very much impacted by how others look at us. And the fact is, when someone has expectations of you and sees potential, and it's sincere, there's no question it brings out very profound strengths inside of a person. And the opposite, unfortunately, is more common. People who don't believe in you, or constantly, maybe they don't believe in themselves either, when you encounter them, they always give you good reasons why you shouldn't feel confident or strong about your convictions or dreams and aspirations. That's how it is. So this is not just a philosophical discussion. It comes down to really our possibilities, and we all have our struggles and challenges, and how we grow through them in real ways is dependent on this. I mean, to drive the point home, even though it's a sad example, but I have to use it. It's very common today, unfortunately. Often, what we expect of love in our own lives is what we saw of the love as we grew up. If a person grew up in a home where their parents were at each other's throats, a home that was full of hostility and betrayal and other unloving things, that becomes your standard, whether you like it or not. So as you go into your own metaphor, as you merge and go into your own journey in finding love, your expectations are what you saw, which is natural. It's not a critique, it's just the way it is. We expect of what we saw around us. And if the bar was low and the standard was low, that's what we may expect, and we would be surprised to see anything greater than that, which of course is sad, because just because our parents or others that we witnessed did not live up to their potential, that doesn't mean that it wasn't there, and it doesn't mean that you don't have it. What they happen to them is their problem. But the fact is, children are impressionable, and we do develop standards based on what we've seen. We have no other standard to go by. Which is why, in a way, the Mishnah says, in the Pirkei Avot, in the Ethics of the Fathers, it says, "Ein lecha ben chayrin el misha esek b'Torah." You don't have a free person unless someone who studied Torah. Which is like a strange statement. What does freedom have to do with studying Torah? It's interesting, the Mishnah doesn't say everyone who studies Torah is free, and that you can also see empirically. But it does say that you can't be free without Torah. And let me explain, because the word Torah is not just someone who learns Chumash and Rashi, or Shulchan Aruch, Code of Jewish Law, or Talmud, or is well versed and in all the Talmudic and in all the Torah literature and scholarship. Learning Torah means learning about a divine perspective on life. So we are trapped by the perspective that we assumed, and we assimilated based on what we saw in our homes and our environments, our schools, and so on. So if one really wants to be free, you have to find a perspective, like a backdrop of something more beautiful or greater, and that brings you freedom, because if not, you will be trapped by what you grew up with. So the gift of Torah is that it gives you a perspective that is beyond the subjective one that we usually go through in life. So when you learn about people like Abraham and Sarah and Moses and other great people, these are like archetypes that you can apply and learn from, in a way transcend our own limitations and some of the negative stuff that we learned in our lives. The only way to counter, in other words, a flawed role models or low standards in love and relationships that we may have grown up with in our homes or in our societies, or what you see on television, is by having, juxtaposing to that another perspective that gives you a broader horizon, and you could say, okay, here's something I can live up to. It's the only way to really find freedom. So that's why that Mishnah says that statement. But to go back to our discussion here, this, as I said, is not just semantics. It happens to be has critical and far-reaching implications of how we look at each other and the potential we're capable of. If you want to find love and a healthy and enduring love in your life, you have to believe it's possible. If you don't believe it's possible because you saw otherwise in your own childhood, or you see your friends or others, everyone failing at it, it doesn't give you hope in the spirit, and doesn't give you hope in your own relationships. And that's why we have to know this at all times. Just because you read a book where you suddenly get inspired by a movie and you cry by some romantic scene, that doesn't mean that you suddenly develop the standard of how to achieve that type of love. That's a moment that touches us. But to develop it requires really seeing models, or archetypes, as I said, that give you a different perspective on the whole thing. And of course, believing that it's possible. And to believe it's possible, we have to understand that the spirit has a type of, what's the word I want to use, infatigable, unlimited resources that our potential carries, that we have yet to even scratch its surface. And this is why, one of the reasons we study the Torah in that context, and that's the way I try to present it at this class, not in a way that is usually you'll hear in a regular yeshiva education, but one that speaks about us and our possibilities. So with that in mind, and this whole background that I've just given about whether we are fundamentally beautiful people and good people, or the opposite, selfish people, I want to address the theme of this week's chapter in that context. So on a technical level, the story goes that the Jews leave Egypt in this book of Exodus. And in this book of Exodus, the second book of the 5 books of the Torah, there are 3 central themes in this book. One is, as I said, the exile and then the exodus from Egypt. The second is the revelation at Sinai. And here in this chapter comes the 3rd central theme, and that's the building of the sanctuary. So around a year after they left Egypt, they're told, Moses begins this week's chapter, God commands him, Vayikhu Terumah, go to the Jews and gather from them contributions, gold, silver, copper, and it goes through different materials that they all contributed. And then a few verses later it says, gather it all together, and then in one succinct sentence, V'asili migdash v'shachanti b'seichem, and build for me a sanctuary, and I will rest among you. So 2 words, v'shachanti b'seichem, I will rest among you. Maybe the shortest mission statement you'll ever hear. And it's the essence of all of life, as we'll see. So here the Jews they're beginning their 40-year journey in this wilderness, just having left Egypt, leaving Sinai. And as they begin their journey in the wilderness, God tells them, build me a sanctuary here in the wilderness. At that point, it was still a portable sanctuary, called a Mishkan, because they were traveling. So this Mishkan was portable. It was built out of materials that could be easily built and then packed up and then traveled with. And they traveled with this Mishkan through the whole journey, 40 years, until they got to the Promised Land. And even then, the Mishkan continued to move from one place to the next, until finally the permanent temple, which is an extension of this commandment, was built in Jerusalem. So when you go to the Western Wall today and the Temple Mount, it's all an extension of this commandment. Build for me a sanctuary, or I'll rest among you. So it began portable, and then it turned into something permanent. And once it became permanent, that became the final temple, so to speak. So what exactly is its deeper meaning on a personal level in the context of what we were discussing here? So wilderness is very obvious, as I often pointed out here, that all these symbols and events and even places and names in the Torah are all really spiritual archetypes. They're all existent today, just as they existed then, which is a critical point which I have to emphasize because you may not have heard it before, as I once didn't hear it when I went to yeshiva, that when you read the Bible, usually you think of it in terms of a history book of telling us the story of what happened thousands of years ago, whether it was in Egypt or in the wilderness or in Israel or prior to that in the Garden of Eden, all the stories of the Bible, which on a very literal level, it is that. Story of our history, so to speak, the roots, the genesis of the Jewish people. However, besides for the fact that if you think of it as that way, there are many glaring gaps in this history book. It's missing fundamental stories and episodes and periods. For instance, just on a simple example, if you think of it in terms of historical context, the book of Genesis, for instance, covers around 2,000 years. One book. From the book of Exodus, 4 books, all the way till the Jews come to the Promised Land, cover 40 years. So if this was in any way was some type of history, it's sure out of this proportion. 4 books that cover 40 years, and 1 book that covers 2,000 years. And then when you look at the stories about Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, it's also very interesting. It's complete. Till Abraham is 75 years old, you have no word, 1 word. He was born and that's it. For 75 years we have no idea from the Bible, that is, what Abraham was doing. Suddenly at age 75 we start hearing his story. And then the story of Isaac, it's completely sporadic. It seems almost like random events in each of these people's lives. So the Zohar emphasizes and says that anyone calls the Torah a storybook is gravely mistaken, and as a matter of fact, the Zohar uses even stronger terminology, which I won't repeat, and basically misses the whole point. So what is the Torah then? If it's not telling us the story in some type of balanced way, what is it? So the mystics and the scholars put it this way, and I quote from the Shalah. Shalah says, it's a very radical statement, and I guarantee even if you went to yeshiva, you probably never heard this. That's how interesting the statement is. He says the following. He says that people think the Torah talks about things down here and alludes to things up there. Using his words, Medaberes betachtenim u'meramezes be'elyonim. Discusses things down here, meaning in the physical plane, and alludes to things in the spiritual levels. He says that's not right. The Torah is Medaberes be'elyonim u'meramezes betachtenim. The Torah is really a spiritual story. And it speaks in the language of earth, or as you know the expression, Dibra Torah b'loshen b'nei Adam. The Torah speaks in the language of human beings. So even though all these events happen in their time in a very literal sense, but its true story is far, far beyond geography and history. It's a spiritual blueprint. And that's why the Medrash calls the Torah an actual blueprint, like an architect uses a blueprint by which he uses to build the structure. God uses the Torah as a blueprint. You can say a CAT scan of God's mind, uses it to create this universe. And that's how it explains the verse right in the beginning of the Bible. It says, Vayemer Elokim yehi or, vayehi or. God said, let there be light, and there was light. Tell me, tell me who composed that sentence? It's a very weird sentence. Why don't you just say, God created light? It saves words. The Torah is always so brief. What does it mean? God said, let there be light, and there was light. And this continues to repeat throughout the whole book of the whole first chapter of Genesis, the beginning of Genesis, the creation, like a redundancy. God said, and there was light. God said, let there be a heaven, there was a heaven. God said, let there be man, there was man. So the Zohar and the Medrash explain, because this is how an architect works. First, he put it into a blueprint, and then he read from his blueprint, let there be light. That's what it said in the blueprint. And that's how he built it. So it's really the process of creating based on a blueprint. So if you really were able to read the Torah in the proper way, what you would come away with is a snapshot of the inner workings, the DNA of existence, the DNA of our own souls, of our own psyches, of the cosmos. That's really what it's like an X-ray of the soul. That's ultimately what the Torah is like. And the stories, Abraham and the stories of Isaac and Jacob and everything, are all real. They happen in their time. But above all, they're happening right now in a way that transcends time and space. And there's a piece of all of that inside of us all. One of my big dreams, I don't know if I'll ever do this magnum opus, is to write a spiritual version of what the Torah sounds like when you read it from above, not below. Because we read it in the story form, in a very literal level, which it has its value and is definitely a part of the whole picture. But to read it on that personal level is a whole different challenge. And that's when the Torah really comes alive. When you say, Torah is chayenu v'erech yameinu, we say in the evening prayer, the Torah is our life and our sustenance. What exactly? When you read the book of Vayikra about all the offerings and about purity and impurity, how is that our life and our sustenance? Or even read this week's chapter about the Mishkan. You could say, hey, they built a sanctuary thousands of years ago. It was very nice. Then it was destroyed, and that's it. So how is it our life and our sustenance? Yes, we cry for it every Tisha B'Av. We pray that the temple should be rebuilt. But how is that our life? Our life and sustenance today is based on other so-called other things that sustain us. The answer is because these themes, these ideas live on, and as I'm going to discuss it. I usually week after week I try to discuss different themes from different chapters. But carrying this back to the theme of this chapter, so let's discuss this verse. So interestingly, just read the verse itself. What does it say? Build for me a sanctuary, and I will rest where? B'seicham, among you. In English, when you say, build for me a sanctuary, it should say, I will rest in it, in the sanctuary. So it seems like a weird sentence. Build for me a structure, and I will rest among you. Which you? If you want to talk about you, God should say, it should just say, I will rest among you. So again, the Shalah and other commentaries, the Rosh Chachma and others, explain that the purpose of the structure was not that God should rest among stones and wood or other materials, but that it was a channel for the divine presence within us, within our lives. So if you think of it that way, that v'shachanti b'seichem is also exists today. Does God rest among us or not in our lives? Yes, we may not have the physical sanctuary, but that doesn't mean that there is no us and that there's no God that dwells among us. It may be through different ways, which is why the Talmud says, for instance, that today through prayer we achieve tfilas b'mkeim karbonos tiknum. That prayer today has replaced the offerings that were brought in the temple, and many different aspects of the temple are reflected in different activities that we do. And the purpose of our lives today has not changed. It's still the purpose is that God should rest among you, meaning within each of our hearts and our souls. In a strange way, it says this in some books, in some holy books, when the temple existed, they may have missed the point even, because they may have thought that God is resting in the temple. Today we have no choice but to know it's within us, because there is no temple to depend upon. Which is one of the reasons the temple was destroyed, because the people, God was not resting among the people, He was resting inside the temple. And God said, the reason the temple was destroyed, the Talmud says, was because of sinas chinam, which is baseless hatred. So people are hating each other. Where's there room for God in their lives? So once there was no longer a container to contain the divine in people's lives, there's no purpose for the structure. This isn't about some type of nice activity. You escape into the holy temple and you find God. If God does not rest among people and there's no love and there's hatred, there's no room for a temple. The temple has no purpose. So to take this theme a little further into context of what I was saying earlier, Jews are beginning their travel in the wilderness. Clearly the temple was meant to be the sanctuary was meant to be exactly what a sanctuary means. Like an oasis, a place of an insulated, protective zone that protects them from the forces of the wilderness. That was the point of the temple. In a more spiritual, psycho-spiritual language, you could say that we live in a cruel world, and the purpose of life is to build within this hostile world sanctuaries, a place where we can feel at home, where our souls and our hearts and our inner selves can feel at home, comfortable. In effect, a place where God feels comfortable and God can rest among us. So in one sentence, in one verse, the purpose of existence is stated. That I send your souls down to a material world that by its own inherent nature can be very selfish and very cruel, very hostile, cold world. But I give you the commandment and the strength and the blessing that you can build a sanctuary and you can manifest the divine in your life, including a place where your soul feels comfortable. Is this really doable? So when we're young children and have not yet been exposed, hopefully, to some of the war zone of life. So I don't know if you remember your little childhood, but if you look at children who grow up in healthy homes, it's a little, you could be envious of them because they have no clue of what life is like. And you can call them naive and unaware and have not yet developed maturely, but there's a certain beauty to it because they see life as a beautiful place. Of course, I'm talking about growing up in a healthy home. Unhealthy home we'll talk about soon. But in a healthy home, that's what it's like. A child is living in a fantasy world. Protected, provided for. Not even mentioning a child in his mother's womb, where in the womb everything is provided for without any difficulties. There's no weather changes there. There's no room for people's moods. A child is provided for completely in a healthy way, especially if the mother is having a healthy pregnancy and behaving in a healthy way. And the early formative years, the same is true. And thank God, the way God made it was that the transition is slow. You're not thrust into a cruel world. It takes time. First few years before you leave your home, then you go to school. School, you still live in a certain type of, cocoon. But as you start getting older and start becoming more self-conscious of yourself and of others, you start seeing the competitiveness, sometimes the cruelty, the envy, and some of the more ugly parts of human nature. And then, of course, it becomes completely full-blown when you leave school and you go into the real marketplace. And then the first times that you meet corruption, maybe this is a good meditation. Was the first disappointment you've ever really had in people or in institutions? Where you trusted someone and they betrayed your trust. Or you loved somebody and your love was lost. The examples go on and on. We all have our moment of epiphany when you suddenly realize, hey, this is not such a beautiful world. Maybe the world is beautiful. People are not always so kind. And sometimes your best friends can become your enemies. And when it comes to self-interest, people do things that you would never imagine. And when it comes to money, forget about it. And what happens at that point is suddenly, well, not suddenly, as I said, it's transitionary. It's in stages. But from a little child that was once naive and never understood duplicity and deceptiveness and greed, suddenly you realize this world is a very greedy place. And people will stoop to very low levels, low standards when it comes to their own needs. And will justify it and will lie, and the list goes on. I don't need to elaborate. You haven't come here tonight to hear about what goes on all day. You don't need me for that, right? I'm here to talk about the other side of things. So I just want to make sure nobody leaves before I finish my punchline. But this is a reality we all face. And then there's another part of ourselves that craves for some peace and some love and some understanding and people we can trust. But they come far and, what is this expression? Far and in between? Sorry? There we go. Far and wide and far in between. Whatever. You get the idea. Huh? There you go. So who coined that? And at sometimes life can be so oppressive, you wonder whether you can ever really find ultimate solace. Sadly, I've heard things that I'd rather not repeat from people who tell me, for me a good day is if nobody beat me up that day. That's already good. It's hard to see because what happens is, as people get hurt, they lower their standards and their expectations. I don't know where each of you stand. Everybody has their own share of experiences. But I would like to believe that everybody still remains, some pilot flame remains alive, even those of us that have suffered greatly, that believes that there is something to be found, in our lifetimes, of course. But especially in the area of relationships, especially in New York City, it seems like even though there's always hope, runs eternal. Again, a misquote from some cliche, I know. Doesn't matter. You want to correct me? Springs of hope, right, exactly. But you get the idea. But then the clock ticks, and we get older, and I'm not trying to depress anybody, and you wonder whether, am I going to find real love in this world? Enduring love. And how much do I have to compromise? And so on. So all these questions are actually the theme of this week's chapter, if you really think of it in personal terms. So it's exactly what was going on then. The Jews had just left Egypt, oppressed for 210 years, a real Holocaust. So their scars were still, the wounds were open. So they received the Torah and they had many gifts and blessings. And then it begins, it's not like they suddenly enter in the promised land, a new journey is starting, and it's a wilderness called Midbar Sinai. The Torah later will call this wilderness a very harsh wilderness, full of enemies lurking and so on. No water. So if you think of it in psychological terms, as I said, think of it in its eternal message, not as just a geographical location somewhere in the Middle East, but something inside of us. We all have our wilderness that we live in. A real wilderness, a real midbar that is void of life, civilization, of sustenance. And you can get very depressed when you look around how people treat each other. Yes, it's true, as I mentioned before, and I should mention again, there's plenty of acts of love and nobility and beauty. I'm not dismissing that. But when you look at the entire equation, there's a lot of pain, and there's a lot of oppression, and a lot of injustice that human beings perpetrate on each other. So before they begin this journey, God tells Moses a critical message. Tell the people, and this includes us, not just the people then, that there's hope. You have the power. I'm giving you here the power and the mitzvah. Mitzvah comes from the root connection. I'm giving you a connection. That you can, in your wilderness, no matter how barren and how difficult your challenges may be, you can build a sanctuary. And I will tell you how to do it. And that's why the Torah now begins chapters that elaborate, not once, not twice, 3 times, with all the brevity of the Torah when it comes to building the temple. It's probably the most elaborate story you'll read in the entire Torah. First commandment, exactly how to build it, from what materials, every detail, down to the detail, the measurements. And then the next chapter, when they actually build it, it's repeated again. And then a 3rd time, when they finally erect it and they put it up, again all the details are summed up. Terumah, Tetzava, Kisisa, Vayakal, Pekudei. The next 5 chapters are all about the temple. I mean, there are some other themes in Kisisa, but But overall, it's the temple repeated 3 times, literally the same, similar details, with some nuances that are different. And again, it's inconsistent. When you look at the Torah, you'll see other stories that seem to be much more important. You don't hear every detail. Why do we have to know how many cubits and how long and how wide and how every detail was measured? Why do we need to know that? I mean, if you think of it from an oral Torah and written Torah, it could have been written in brief, and the oral Torah could have interpreted as it does with many other verses in detail. But here the written Torah feels it necessary to go into all of this detail. The only real answer for the question is, of course you could say the Mishkan is very important, but there are many things that the Torah, for example, putting on tefillin, you need a whole section of the Talmud to tell you exactly how to put on tefillin because it's too cryptic in the Bible. And tefillin is just one mitzvah, just to put it on your head, on your arm. And you still don't know from the verses exactly how to do it. And the same with so many other mitzvahs. So it's not because you have to actually do it that the written Torah doesn't always elaborate on everything. The ultimate answer is because the Mishkan is the most important thing in life, in our lives. There's an entire book called Terumah, written by the author by the Ramah, Ramosha Isserlish. He is also known as one of the codifiers of Jewish law. You've heard of the Shulchan Aruch, right? So the Shulchan Aruch is called the Code of Jewish Law. So there are different versions of it. The first codifier of Jewish law, just as a tangent, a footnote, was Maimonides. Rambam was the first one that codified, took all the Talmudic literature and organized it under sections, the laws of Shabbos, the laws of kosher, the laws of the temple, the laws of and so on. Purity, impurity, etc. After him came other called poskim, or others who codified Torah law. You have the Rosh. The next big one is the Tur. And then comes the Beis Yosef, Joseph Caro, who did what's called the Shulchan Aruch. And he had a commentator called the Ramah, who lived in Germany. And as a matter of fact, many of the things of the Ramah are more for the Ashkenazim, follow the Ramah more, and the Sfardim follow more of the Beis Yosef, who lived in Sfat. And the Ramah also, besides being a codifier of Jewish law, also wrote mystical works. And one of his dominant is called Torah Sa'olah. Literally, it means the Torah, the doctrine of Ola was the name of one of the offerings, called the elevated offering. And the entire book is dedicated to one fascinating theme. He takes every detail of these chapters about the Mishkan, about the sanctuary, and explains its spiritual, mystical, and personal dimension, based on the principle that the Mishkan was a microcosm of the human being. So I once discussed this a few years ago at length and detail. I'll just touch upon a few key points. The Mishkan that we're talking about here is built in 3 sections. There were 3 parts to the temple. One was called the Oil Moed, which was like the outer courtyard. Then there's the Kodesh, or the Azara, the Kodesh and the Kodesh Kadashim, the Holy and the Holy of Holies. And they explain, many commentators explain it, that this is like the 3 parts of a human body: the head, the chest and the heart, and the legs. So the Holy of Holies had one vessel. It was called the Aron, the Holy Ark. The Ark had within it the tablets and the Torah. So that's comparable to the mind. The central nervous system is the Holy of Holies, which is the mind, the head. The next section in the sanctuary had 3 vessels. You had a menorah. Menorah was the candelabra that was lit every day. You had the shulchan, a table, where they brought fresh loaves of bread, were baked. And you had the mizbeach, the internal altar. And here they explain this is like the 3 parts: the right arm, the left arm, and the heart. Or in Kabbalistic terminology, chesed, gvura, tiferet. Okay? Which is, chesed is love, gvura is discipline, and tiferet is the heart, is the center plane. And then the outer section of the temple is compared to the extremities. The legs is the largest part of the temple, like it is with the human body. As you travel upward, the head is the smallest, the chest is next, and the legs are the longest. As I said, I discussed this once at length, and there are, I believe, you can get the CDs of it, or I probably also wrote it up maybe on in some articles on our website. The reason I'm mentioning it here is because what we have in this chapter, these chapters, is an elaborate formula, like a comprehensive blueprint of how one creates an oasis in the wilderness of our lives. That's the bottom line. That we have the power to build a sanctuary. As life, as cruel and as challenging and as cold and hostile the world around us is, we have the power in this wilderness to build something permanent that will serve as a true, the word is not escape, but a true oasis, a true environment that is warm and beautiful amidst all the darkness around us. So, if you grew up in a beautiful home, and I use the emphasis on the word home, and I don't mean beautiful, I don't mean physically beautiful. Because the difference between a home and a house is this. A house perhaps is a shelter. It protects you from the elements, from rain, snow, cold, from strangers, from thieves. But the question is, besides protecting you, does it give you anything? You know, they tell that story of God, his own, they say God, his own sense of humor. So, there was the two homes, the two families that lived in a town, in one of the shtetls. And one was blessed, they were both blessed. One was blessed with a lot of children, and one was blessed with a lot of wealth. Okay, so one family had like 11 children, and no penny to their name. And another home, God forbid they didn't have any children, but they were very wealthy. Okay. So came the day before Yom Kippur, the eve of Yom Kippur, and when in heaven they make all the big decisions of like what the year will be like, the destiny for each person's life. So as luck would have it, the wealthier family, they were friends. So she calls up her friend, she says, listen, since you may want to go to shul for Yom Kippur, why don't you bring your children over to my house? We have everything we need here, the wealthy home. I'll have someone watch over them, and we'll go to shul together. Okay, great. So in heaven, the angels, as they're looking down what everybody needs. So they see these two homes. They see one home is cold, is dark, and there's no children, because all the children went over to the wealthy home. They said, this home needs to have children. So they gave a blessing. There should be another few children in the next few years. The other home, they saw full of children. They said, they need more money to support these children. This is when the twist of the wires get a little twisted. So sometimes, the blessings come down, but they come down in the wrong directions, and they need a little correction, which we can achieve. The reason I tell the story is because you go into a home, you could have a home that's very opulent. As I remember someone sharing with me, she grew up in France. She grew up in an aristocratic home and family. Everything she needed was there financially, but there was no love in the home. She told me about the nights she used to spend waiting for her parents to come home. She had a palace. Everything was there. She had sculptures and paintings and every toy, every game, but there was nothing that resonated with love. And the first time she went into a home where she found love was none of this opulence. It was like a poor home, but she saw the love. And obviously we all would love to be able to say we should have both blessings together. And I bless that on all of us. But sometimes you can have a house and you don't have a home. A home, the way the Talmud, and especially the mystics, explain a home, a dira. Let me explain what a home is. We all, what are they called? When we go out into the world, there's different masks that we wear as we project to different people. You meet different friends that you have, and each person you show a different face. We live in a world we adjust to the people around us. Where's there a place in your life where you can really kick off your shoes and just be yourself? Is there such a thing? Do we have the opportunity to do that? So if we grew up as I said earlier, in a healthy home, you have an opportunity to do that because your parents, who loved you unconditionally and nurtured you, built a self-confidence that you feel that comfort. And you just know that you are entitled and deserve it. If you grew up in a battle zone, in a home that you didn't get that nurturing, what it ultimately does is undermines your right to have such comfort. And therefore, the rest of life can often be always hostile. You always have your guard up. And you don't have the ability to ever let down that guard. And we develop these very sophisticated defense mechanisms and hard armor that's very difficult to pierce. So then you meet somebody in your life, you date someone, and maybe you don't show that armor right away, but as soon as you feel threatened or vulnerable, that armor comes up because you have not learned to be able to be comfortable with yourself. I don't know if this resonates with anybody here. Maybe none of you have this issue. So if you don't, just share it with friends that may have it. These issues do exist out there. So we develop, sometimes to our own detriment, we become our own worst enemy. You've developed such sophisticated mechanisms, you yourself can't even free yourself from it. And you don't know when to let go, when not to let go. And then when you do allow yourself to be vulnerable a bit, you can get hurt. And then you run right back into your protective zone. What are all these extraterrestrial noises I hear? Huh? Don't worry, it's not as bad as... it always reminds me of the chicken one in for another time. I think I told it once and somebody was insulted by it. Huh? Right? I should tell them? I don't want to insult anybody. It was actually meant to be humorous. It was quite endearing. So I did a Shabbaton once in the Karbach Shul, and it was like they served the chicken, and then I got up to speak, and suddenly I hear the cry of a rooster. I mean, we not only I heard it, we all heard it. Let me get that straight. We all heard this call of a rooster, and first I said, wait a second, I just saw the chicken. Maybe they didn't slaughter one of the chickens or something. It's running around, a chicken. And then we discovered that some chickens sound like cell phones. Okay, let's put it this way. So I told this story, actually, and somebody pointed out to me that they took the message that I was saying that people leave their cell phones on the Karbach Shul. So I just want to say for the record, it's not just in the Karbach Shul. In many shuls, these things happen. Sometimes the cell phone goes off. It was not meant to be reflective on that shul. It's just the story. I would just always remember, whenever cell phones go off in the middle of a talk, I always find this to be a good distraction in case, to break up the intensity of the discussion. Okay, no connection to sanctuary or to anything. At least not ostensibly. So what we have is a situation, and if you see this quite often, sometimes an imbalance. Some people are just too vulnerable and get hurt, and some people have become so invulnerable and that they've concealed the vulnerable part inside of themselves. So this idea of building a sanctuary, of building a home for your soul, and let me tell you why I'm saying soul, even though it says, "V'shechanti b'seichem," I will rest among you. What does it mean God will rest among us? Let's not forget, us is each of human being that was created in the divine image, as the Bible says in the beginning, B'tselem Elokim. The question is whether you're aware of it, where the divine rests among you, within you, or it's concealed. The sanctuary's purpose is to help reveal the divine within us, which is the soul within each of us. So if you can't create a home, an environment where your soul is comfortable in this world, you will never be able to really create a relationship that can be enduring. This includes a physical home, but I'm not just referring to a physical one. It means a place where you can be yourself and you don't have to masquerade to satisfy other people's needs, which is what we do most of the time. Whether you're in business or in some other way, you're selling something or buying something, we are always in a process of negotiation, of projecting, and having to satisfy different people. I'm not suggesting we've all sold out, but we have many compromises that we have to make when we need things. Some of us more than others. It's not a small little prayer we say every day or every time we make a blessing, Birchat HaMazon, after the meal, we would say, Loy Lidei Matnas Basar V'Dam, may God bless us, that we should not be dependent on gifts from human beings, that we should be self-sustained. Because as soon as you're dependent on others, especially for financial sustenance, you begin to, what's the word for it? You begin to, I don't want to use any negative expression, you begin to cater to them, I guess is the right word. There's stronger terms for it. Not for a rabbi to say. You begin to, you do things that compromise yourself. As I said, sometimes it goes over the line, sometimes not. But at some point, you start wondering, who am I, and what am I projecting? And that type of comfort, to be comfortable with yourself in a way that's really able to be vulnerable and strong. Let's put it this way, to celebrate your vulnerability is not such an easy thing in this world. Because either if you're vulnerable, you can get hurt. So how can you be strong and vulnerable at the same time? Many of us don't understand how that's possible. That's possible when you know how to be comfortable with your soul. And it's about you and you yourself, between you and God. And that takes a lot of work, which is why the building of the sanctuary is so elaborated upon, to give us the true tools how to build something like that in our lives. And every one of the vessels, starting from the ark, and the menorah, and the table, and the altar, and the outer altar, are all components that teach us how to transform a part of our lives and turn it into a home for the divine. So it's all about understanding that we have two realities. One is the hostile world around us, that you either have to escape from or become part of. That's how most of us think of it. But in truth, there's another option, and that is that you have another life inside of you, your inner life, your soul. And your soul can become comfortable if you build a home for it. And when you build a home for it, then when you enter that hostile world, you have a clear boundary and understand, I'm entering there, I don't have to be afraid of it, I don't have to compromise myself, and I also don't have to escape from it. So you'll find people, when they deal with the challenges of life, either go one extreme or the other. Either you escape or you become part of it. You're either part of the problem or part of the solution. And escapism is just another form of not being able to handle it. So what most of us do is compartmentalize. What God is telling Moses in this chapter is saying, you're living in a wilderness. That's a fact. But you have the power to build something there. And once you build it, you will have protection, and you'll be able to handle the wilderness as well. It will not vanquish you because you will have your core center. And how does he begin telling us how to do it? It's interesting. Not through spiritual meditations, and not through prayer, and not through study of Torah. God says to Moses, gather from them contributions, financial contributions, money. So the great Moses, the giver of law, who just came down from Mount Sinai just a little while earlier, becomes a fundraiser, basically. I've taken much consolation from this story. He becomes a fundraiser, which is interesting. Why? Because it's a strange division of labor. Everyone knows Moses could have used his time much better to teach, to inspire, to answer questions, to counsel, give counsel, and so on. That's what Moses' strength is. Why don't you hire someone else to become the fundraiser? You see, God has no problem with delegating. For example, it comes to architect of the Mishkan was not Moses. It's Betzalel. So it's not like Moses is given to do everything. Betzalel is the actual architect. He's the builder, contractor, whatever you want to call it. Moses guides him, but he's the builder. So clearly there can be a division of labor here. And yet God says Moses himself is the one that is told, you go and collect the contributions. And not spiritual contributions, as I said, very physical ones. Kesef, Zov, Necheshes, gold, silver, copper, materials. People donated their services. The weavers wove. I mean, the Torah elaborates how everybody contributed. But it was Moses that initiated it. Which is an interesting, you could say almost paradox. You're going to build a sanctuary for divine and for the soul. Why do you have to connect it with money altogether? This is like a spiritual activity. As a matter of fact, the world of money is where the world of hostility exists, and that's where the wilderness is. Because money creates competitiveness, and money creates greed. And all the self-interests that are driven by money really undermine the building of anything that's spiritual. As the Meraglim, the scouts later will say, when they see the promised land, they say, Eretz Eicheles Sheshveh, it's a land that consumes its inhabitants. Wall Street is a land that consumes its inhabitants. How many people will maintain spiritual integrity in a place where there's such competition, so much pressure to succeed, and all of that? How could you even remain spiritual in a place like that? And yet, you see that God doesn't just say, create a spiritual oasis. He says, take the money, take the hostile and the cold and selfish world, and create from that, you'll create a sanctuary. And you'll find this paradox throughout the Torah. It's very interesting, especially if you study and contrast between other mystical systems, like, let's say, Far Eastern mysticism, or other mystical disciplines. You'll always find that the mysticism is directly in proportion to asceticism, removing yourself from the material world. You never find mysticism within the material. You find it when you really go away from the material. And if you want to meditate, and you want to find some type of deeper spiritual unity, you have to get away from the rat race, basically. Judaism is the only mystical system that says that you can find more spiritual power in materialism than in spiritual worlds. Which seems like a paradox, right? But it isn't, because for one critical reason, as the mystics explain. Because God is not closer to the spiritual realms than he is to the material realms. So usually we think of two worlds. There's the materialism and there's spirituality. And God is the spiritual and material is the physical. It's not correct. In Jewish thought there are three levels. There's the material, there's the spiritual, and then there's the divine. When you say, for example, Kedusha, holiness, sanctity is not just spiritual. And a simple example would be, you can be spiritual and you can also be arrogant. There are spiritually arrogant people. They feel elitist. They feel they're superior to their material counterparts. When it comes to the third level, the key thing that shines inside of a person that's divine and not just spiritual is humility, bittul. It's not about you. In Tanya and other places there's an expression, yesh misha oyev. A spiritual person can be a very, very arrogant person. I am so spiritual that I am connected to God more than anybody else. There's such a phenomenon too. And being divine, however, is beyond material and the spiritual. The way one of the Kabbalists puts it is like this. It's an interesting statement. He says, God has the power to create the finite as much as he has to create the infinite. Because to say that God can create infinity and cannot create finite, that itself is finite. That itself is a limitation. So think of that twist. To say something is infinite and cannot manifest in the finite is also finite. Because it's saying it's this and not that. Basically stating that God is beyond the infinite and beyond the finite, beyond heaven and beyond earth. So in the mystical structure of things, what you have is really three levels. You have matter, spirit, and a third dimension that is able to integrate the two. I believe this is unique to Jewish mysticism. I've never seen in any other school of thought this third dimension on that level. And that's why when King Solomon says to God when he builds the temple, so there's an expression in Tanakh, in the book of Kings. So King Solomon says to God, in a surprising tone, he says, Shamayim v'shmei shamayim lo yichal kalucha. The heavens and the heavens of heavens cannot contain you. V'chi habayis hazeh, can this little home, this little physical structure called the temple contain you? If heavens and heavens of heavens cannot contain the divine, how could a physical structure on earth contain you? And God says to him, read the same verse, but don't read it as a surprise, read it as an answer. Heavens and heavens and heavens cannot contain me, but this physical abode, I have willed that it can contain me because I am not bound by heavens. I am as close to you on earth as I am to heaven. It's basically stating that the ultimate reason we confuse the material and the spiritual is because there's a power that's beyond both of them, which may seem to us initially paradoxical. Because you think, If you're going into the realm of the spiritual, you're going into the infinite, you're going into unity as opposed to multiplicity. But if you think that God's essence is neither one nor many, then the one and the many can become one, which is like harmony within diversity. You don't have to annihilate this material world, in other words, to connect to something higher. Which is why there's a debate between the Rambam and the Ramban, two greats, Maimonides and Nachmanides, whether the ultimate reward in this world will be spiritual reward or material reward. Will it ultimately be that we will be souls without bodies, or that the ultimate reward will be souls within bodies? And Maimonides makes the argument that a body is always inferior to a soul. How could one really benefit from spiritual reward when they have the confines and the limits of bodily constraints? But the Ramban argues that no, that God is neither body nor soul, and therefore they can both join. And that is ultimately the way the mystics paskin, as they say. That's the final ruling, that you can unite the two. So essentially, the sanctuary then is really a symbol of not finding escape from a material world. It's taking a material world and turning it into a home for the soul, which is much greater achievement. Because if you think about it, why do you think Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, you find in the book of Genesis, they all chose to be shepherds? They chose to be shepherds because a shepherd is somewhat removed from the material pressures of life. Sheep are very docile creatures. They graze in the meadows. While our forefathers were able to meditate in the fields, pray, search for God. So it's a very conducive for spiritual meditation is to be a shepherd, which is why they all chose to be shepherds. Yet we find who is the first businessman among our ancestors. It was Joseph. He became firstly an accountant, the first Jewish accountant, in case you wonder. He made the cheshbonos for Potiphar. When he came down to Egypt, he ends up being in Potiphar's house. It was one of the ministers of Pharaoh, and he becomes the cheshbonos, the Targum says there. He was the accountant. And then later, after interpreting Pharaoh's dreams, he becomes the Mishnah Lamelech. He becomes the second in command. And what did he do? He ran a business. He turned Egypt into a superpower, basically, because the commodity of the time was grain. And he foresaw that there would be a great famine, which followed a great plenty, many years of plenty. So he stockpiled. So when everyone ran out of food, Egypt became the only source of sustenance, and that turned Egypt into the power that Egypt became. So he dealt with business. So the commentaries say, who was greater, Joseph or his father and grandfather and great-grandfather? Because they were shepherds. So it says when Jacob came and met Joseph after 22 years of separation, his first fear was Joseph compromised? Was he the same Joseph that he remembered when they were together? Remember, Joseph started out as a shepherd too in his early younger years. And when Joseph said to him the Torah that they had studied 22 years earlier, he remembered exactly what they had studied the last time they were together. So Jacob was consoled. He realized that Joseph had maintained his integrity. And the commentaries explain that Joseph was far greater than the shepherds. Because to be a shepherd and separate yourself from Wall Street is one thing. But to be able to be in the marketplace and maintain spiritual integrity is a far harder thing. That's why, I don't know if you've ever heard this, the Talmud says that the mincha prayer, the afternoon prayer, has more power in some ways than the other prayers. It says, because the only prayer where Elijah the prophet answered to was the prayer of mincha. And the Seder Hayom is one of the Middle Age commentaries explains why. The morning prayer seems to be the primary prayer in Judaism. It's a long prayer in the morning. The evening prayer, we say the Shema. The only prayer you don't say the Shema is the afternoon prayer. It's a short prayer, and it's the middle of the workday. So why is that considered in some ways greater than the others? So he answers a beautiful answer. He says, because the morning and afternoon and evening prayers are before you go to work and after you go to work. It's easier to concentrate then. But in the middle of the workday, to rip yourself away from your work and suddenly say, I'm going to pray to God, is not an easy thing to do, and that's why it has a certain intensity, because within the work day, you're able to connect. It's like within the marketplace, you're able to connect. That's the power. There was this chassid who was a businessman as well, but he was very devout. So at the end of the year, he would make his calculations. So he would write Tishrei, or January income and loss, February profit and loss, March, or Tishrei, Cheshvan, Kislev, whatever months he used. When it came to the sum total, instead of writing the number, he wrote Ein Eid Milvadai. There's nothing but God. So you have this balance sheet that he had, this profit and loss statement rather, and you have your, January there's a figure, February there's a figure. At the bottom is nothing but God. So the question was asked about him. If he's so connected, he should have written on every line, January equals God, February equals God, March equals God. Where do you have the presence of mind to remember the numbers there? And he gets to the bottom, that's when he suddenly remembers that the total is God. So the answer they give is very simple. If he wrote on each line God, he shouldn't be in business, he should be in kollel. He shouldn't be running a business. He has to know how to do masa, matan, bamun, you have to know how to do your business. But he was not deceived by the fact that when it comes to the total of it all, the purpose of it all, is that the means, that these are just the means. The total of it all is to bring God into this world. And that's the hardest thing of all, to maintain that type of balance. So of all things, Moses, the great man of Torah, Torah's Moshe, God says, I want you to show an example. As great as Torah is, as your Torah study and your meditation and your prayer and your divine nature, Moses was a man of God. I want you to enter into the physical world. You become a fundraiser. You ask them for the contributions. And from this material, you'll create a sanctuary to the divine. When, no one should know of this, but those of us that say Yizkor, during the Yizkor prayer, during the holidays, 3 times a year, Yom Kippur and the 3 holidays. So when you say Yizkor and you remember your father or mother that passed away, you immediately connect and say, in the memory of my father or my mother, for those that are often, I will donate a certain amount of money. And it seems odd because you're talking about a soul that's departed, they're no longer in this physical world. So you think you dedicate to them a prayer, some study, some volunteer work, but it says specifically a financial contribution. And the reason for that is because the same reason. You want to reconnect the soul to this material world. If you connect it to something spiritual, then you're just sending the soul off to other spiritual realms. It's like creating a body for a soul that has departed. And you do that through the most mundane thing of all, which is good old cash, or good old money. So money, even though on one hand it can be the symbol of greed, and it can be the force that drives people sometimes to being their worst, that's precisely why it has the power, if you use it right, to transform it into a sanctuary. So in essence, what we're talking about here is that if you want to build a home for your soul in this world, yes, on one hand you have to have a comfortable place, but don't think that it's just going to be by escaping. It comes from using the enemy against itself, so to speak. If the enemy of unity is materialism, because everything that's materialistic divides us, and spirituality is what unites us, if you can take your material life and turn it, the arrow the other way around by helping someone else, what you're doing is weakening the hold of the selfish world on you. And when you do that, that's the ultimate way of building a sanctuary. Which is why the first lesson of all is that it's not just about escaping, it's about transforming. Taking that which is so hostile, and can be so hostile, and turning it into something that's so beautiful. Which is why charity is frankly the hardest mitzvah of all. The hardest thing for a person to do is take money out of their pockets and give it. Because money is a symbol of everything we consider of value. My time, my ingenuity, my connections, the whole thing. It's a symbol of soul energy, of everything that you invested your life in. But precisely because of that, it can be the worst enemy in a sense where it's what creates the selfishness inside of you. On the other hand, why stuck is such a great mitzvah is because you are attacking materialism at its core by saying, even though it's hard, because it's so much part of who I consider my value, it's like giving from your flesh. When you give of it, that is ultimately the greatest way you make a home for your soul in your life. So that doesn't necessarily make it easier to give, but if you look at people who are able to do it, you'll see it takes courage to give. It's easier to take than to give. What does the guy say in the Frisco Kid? The train robber, he robs the whole train, and then he jumps off. Before he jumps off, he tells everybody, listen, remember a lesson in life. It's always better to give than to take. And with that, he took everybody's and ran off. Okay. So there's a lesson in that too. And then there's the actual components of the temple that I mentioned before, the 3 sections, that are all part of how one transforms that sanctuary. So, to sum this up, I would say the following. Inside of your little body, whatever size it is, you have a soul. It's confined, it's trapped in a way. It's more than just your heart that's beating. It's a soul. It's a soul. It's touched when you hear music. It's touched when you feel love. And it's touched when you feel pain. That's a soul functioning. Obviously, it has many more dimensions. But the soul is very, very uncomfortable in this world. Because a soul, like a child, does not like to be abused and doesn't like to be used. So the soul stays undercover. Think of a soul like a child. Imagine a child in a room where the child feels hostility. What will a child do? The child will hide under a table inside a closet and won't show its head. But when a child feels love, feels trust, feels safe, the child will emerge. The same is with our soul. Our soul is terrified of this world, actually, because it sees so much pain, and it's so unnatural for a soul, because a soul comes from a world where everything is connected, where what you see is what you get. There's no lies, there's no there's duplicity. Things are seamless. So when a soul enters this world, it's insulated and protected in many ways. But when the soul begins to see how people behave, it's very, very frightened. Which is why we don't like to be vulnerable, why we don't like to expose that part of ourselves, because we're afraid what will happen. This fear doesn't always mean it's conscious. It's like you don't just reveal your intimate self to others. But the intimate self is the soul that's within each of us. And all its life, the soul is looking for a home. That's really what it comes down to, a home in this wilderness. And you have the ability to build the home for your inner child, if you wish, or for your soul. You build it through, first of all, paying attention to it. Second of all, not being distracted. Because the worst thing you can be is become so materialistic, and then your soul feels frightened by you, not just by others. If all you're doing is driven by your self-interest, and how you can acquire more, and how you protect yourself more, what do you think? Your soul starts becoming alienated from you. That's called when you become like split. There's a soul inside of you craving for some attention, for some sustenance, nurturing, and instead you're busy doing something else. So forget about what the fear of others around. Imagine your soul being afraid of you. Your own self is afraid of yourself. It's a pretty, I would say, traumatic thing if you think about it. And we all have moments like that. You may not think of it that way, but that's when you have real conflict. That's real conflict. When you become aware of such a conflict, you can rest assured it's your soul telling you there's something seriously wrong. You're not taking care of me. And therefore, anxiety sets in, depression sets in. Many of psychological dissonance that we experience is a direct result of a soul that is starving and trying to let you know. It has no other way of letting you know except by making you miserable. What other tools does it have? That's how it cries. So don't always think if you're miserable that's a bad thing. I don't know if you feel better about that, but remember, it's like anything. Pain is not a good thing. Nobody likes pain, but trust me, but without pain, we can kill ourselves. Pain means your nerves are working, and they're sensing that there's something wrong. So pain is like a warning signal. You know, it's good. We like to take painkillers to get rid of the pain, but pain, all it is a symptom. Thank God we have nerves, and our nerves tell us that do something fast, or else the pain will get worse, and ultimately it's more than pain. You could actually lose something. Something can become irreversibly damaged. So no one likes pain, but if you think of pain in that sense as a warning signal, then it's a great gift. You know, people that don't feel pain can end up doing things to themselves that are extremely destructive. You become so numb. So sensitive souls, sensitive people will feel angst and anxiety. That's not a blessing per se, but it's a step toward a blessing. It's awareness. It knows, it's telling you something. And this is direct proportion to your soul being comfortable in your body, will be how it will be comfortable in another person's arms. Which means, if you're having difficulty finding love or healthy love in your life, most likely connected somewhat to your soul having difficulty finding love in you, from you. Because if you can't love your own soul, how are you going to love another person's soul? And how will they love you? So often what you try to do is replace, someone else will love me, I don't love myself so much, someone else will love me, they'll compensate for it. I'd like to see if that's ever worked. For short term it can work, but it doesn't really ultimately work because it's like what the Kotzker Rebbe said regarding, I don't think it was about relationships, but he once used this expression. He said, if I am I because you are you, and you are you because I am not and you are not. But if I am I because I am I, and you because you are you, I am and you are. That's the poetic version. If you didn't get the poetic version, simply put, it means this, that if your identity is defined by somebody else, and their identity is defined by you, you're really not being, and that person is not really being. Because it's like the blind leading the blind. But if your identity is generated from within, and you have a sense of identity, and another person's identity is from within, then the two can meet. Because they have that, they have a personality that's in place. You're not looking for a personality in your identity crisis somewhere else. Because Philip tells me that when he was a kid, he used to tell his grandmother, I wish, what did he say? I wish I were you. You know, when kids think, they think if there was someone else, everything will go away. She said, if you were me, who would be me? You know, like that. So we all have different identity issues. The point of all, the bottom line point is this: within this harsh wilderness is a soul. The soul is looking for a home, and you have the power to build it. That's the bottom line. Why couldn't I have said that 2 hours ago and just say good night? Because it wouldn't have impact if we don't realize the whole elaborate thing. Not that I'm on a quota here or anything, or there's a curfew, is there? These classes used to, by the way, used to go to the wee hours, early years, when we all wore younger people's clothing. But now we try to keep it more or less framed so you can get home for the evening news. If that's what your passion is, or the late shows, or the Olympics, whatever it is. So I want to just say in a concluding note, look, I find this chapter very comforting personally, because when you personalize it, it's an unbelievable message in the sense that it acknowledges, it's not that the Torah is trying to create some la-la land situation. It acknowledges very clearly that we live in a harsh wilderness. Each of us can define that any way you like. Let's not. It doesn't have to be generic. Wilderness is whatever it is that's going on in your life, whatever chaos or organized chaos or whatever you want to call it, whatever's going on in your life that is challenging, that is hostile, that is cold, indifferent, is a wilderness in one way or another. On the other end of things, we're told we have the power to build a sanctuary for our souls, a home in the spiritual sense, but also in the physical sense. A home, as I said earlier, is not just a shelter. A home is an environment. It's an environment where you feel loved, people who come into the environment feel loved, feel accepted, non-judgmentalism, where you're accepted for who you are, not what you project, or for what you produce, or your buying power, or other external factors, or your youth, or your looks, but just for who you are, period. That is ultimately a soul that's comfortable. And there are people in this world that can help. We can help each other achieve that when we ourselves aren't that way. Unfortunately, we live in a world where, as I said earlier, everybody is watching everybody else. And it becomes a vicious cycle. But you don't have to be part of that. You could make a choice. And not only you could make a choice, when there's a mitzvah given in the Torah, it's also it comes with power. when you're told you could do something, or you should do something, it means it's a vote of confidence that you can do it, and you're able to do it. So, applying this in our lives, obviously each of us has to do it in our own way, but ultimately in one form or fashion, you have to take something from your material life and give of it. There's no way that you can defang the enemy by avoiding it. You have to take from it and turn it itself inside out, turn it into a sanctuary, which is why the temple was ultimately built from raw materials, including money. Why tzedakah is such a powerful mitzvah. And there are many ways that this manifests. As I said, I discussed this once at length, the actual breakdown of the microcosm of the temple as a microcosm of our lives. I didn't really go into that in detail here, but it could be helpful because it also discusses how we can align our minds. As I said, the Holy of Holies, the holy and the outer court, align it as well in building the sanctuary. I want to bless everybody in this week where we get this power of Mishkan, that you should, in some small way, create a little corner in your home, your environment, your workplace, that is actually a home for your soul, a place of comfort. And may you bring many people comfort, and may they bring you comfort as well. And I hope that in our own way, this right here environment we're sitting in right now can be a microcosm as well of this type of experience. And it just goes to show you that we all have the power to do so. It's not my power. I mean, I'm sitting here and speaking and initiating, but it's a link in a chain that we all can create. Every one of us here has you have your sphere of influence, you have people, and you can initiate things. Just have to be a little creative and a little courage, and stop feeling like you have to respond to others. It's time to initiate. Like I always say, three types of people: people who make news, people who read the news, and or people who make things happen, people who watch things happen, and people who ask what happened. So think which category you fit in. You can make things happen if you wish. It takes a little strength and focus, and it changes your life basically when you have that ability. It builds confidence that you actually can precipitate change. So may it be a very sanctuary type of week for everybody, and may it extend not just for 1 week but for our entire year and entire lives. That being said, let me just say the class has been dedicated by Farkash Financial. Hey, that's a nice name. In honor of Hinda Bas Rochel and Chana Vela Bas Malka. May they have a speedy recovery. Okay? So there's a dedication. If anybody wants to dedicate a class or any program or any of our publications, you could see me or Belville or Paul de Malka. And as far as practical announcements, tomorrow night Philip will give his class at 7 p.m. here. And I will next week continue the Wednesday night series, which if you get the emails, we send out a Wednesday morning reminder of the topic and the theme. So if you don't get the emails, just let us know, and we'll be happy to send it to you. And it's always an honor to sit with kindred spirits and intersect with fellow souls. Thank you so much.